I'm going to be honest with you in that so much world building, character development, explanations happen in this one book that sets up so much shit for the subsequent stories that to talk about it in one review, to distill it to core events and themes, has been very hard. Going off the first review, my love for the series, the fact that I've read most of these books multiple times would lead you to believe I'm a shoo-in, but everything is symbolic and important, and I found myself starting and stopping a dozen times, unsure of what angle I really wanted to go and what points did I really want to talk about and how they all interconnect. But for what it's worth, here's the finished product. I hope you enjoy. If you're unaware, The Vampire Lestat is both a prequel and a sequel to Interview the Vampire, which I did a fairly in-depth and spoiler-filled review of. Now, while you don't necessarily need to read that book or watch that review to understand this book or review, it honestly would help a lot, given that this character and the story build off of that first one. It would help to understand Lestat and his motives. The link is down below. To give a brief summary of Interview and Lestat's part in it, the story is of Louis de Pontelac. He is a Creole vampire from pre-Revolutionary War New Orleans in the 1700s. He starts his interview explaining how he was a moderately wealthy plantation owner who ended up grief-stricken and guilt-ridden over the death of his brother, prompting him to wish for death. And it comes to him in the form of Lestat. Lestat gives Louis a choice: death or be given a new life. Now, Lestat is an antagonistic character in Louis' book. He kills several people a night when he doesn't need more than one. He's cold, condescending, rude, gets into shouting matches and fistfights with Louis. The gist is Lestat is a mean idiot. We're not left with a good impression of the man, and Lestat hopes to correct this. He has been asleep for about 50 years, and then comes the 80s with this new, potent, powerful, different kind of music, the likes of which he's never heard. Rock and roll. It pushes him from his self-dug grave into the neon-lit, sexual, diverse, gritty fun of the 1980s. Within a week, he trades out his rags for a leather jacket and rides on a motorcycle while marveling at the advances in tech, relishes the colorful assortment of clothing and hairstyles, and he seeks out this little band that he could hear when he was still buried called Satan's Night Out. These 20-somethings in their exaggerated makeup and colorful hair, they have this youthful beauty and their music is so passionate, all captivate Lestat, and he wants to join their band. Now, he does something he was instructed to never do. He introduces himself. Vampires are never meant to give their name, nor any other immortals, to humans for the sake of all their kind. So naturally, he's actually surprised when they laugh. They know his name and know that he's a vampire. When he's confused, they give him Louis' book, held together with tape. And from that point on, Lestat is far more motivated. He will spend everything to get his band onto the global stage. He will release his own autobiography at the same time, bolstering his mystique and image to the world as Lestat, the vampire rock star. But to what end? The answer is several-fold. Mainly, he wants to bring vampires into the open and unite them. He wants to find those he loves and misses, and he hopes that if Louis hasn't been murdered, given he's released vampire secrets in his own book, we'll see his story and come to understand the man that he so vilified in his book. To see things that he hadn't before, and maybe they could come together again. He even contemplates at one point the implications of exposing his kind to the world and smiles at the possibility of war between vampires and mortals. And so he starts working with the band, a well-to-do lawyer, and a publicist to bring his plan to fruition. He'll write music and film music videos about the history of vampire kind. Most vampires don't even know their own history and spend much of their time hidden away and alone. He'll tell stories from his own life. He names names and places of his kind, all alongside the release of his highly detailed autobiography, building up off of that fame of Interview the Vampire. He'll make sure to get the best of the best to help ensure quality and exposure of his work. He is a vampire not content any longer to dwell alone amongst the shadows, and he is going to break all of the rules. Now that's where the story starts, hence the sequel aspect, and laying the groundwork for the book to follow, The Queen of the Damned. But this is also a prequel. Before Lestat came to Louis, where did he come from, and where did he go? You thought I was going to break into some cheesy dance song, huh? Turns out Lestat was the third son of a sick and blind aristocrat living in a crumbling castle in rural France. He has two older brothers, their wives, and his nieces and nephews that he takes care of by hunting for food on their ancestral land in a forest surrounding their home, given that he is the youngest, most able-bodied, and doesn't have a family or children of his own. There's also the most important member of his family, Gabrielle, his very distant, non-affectionate mother, whom, despite all of that, despite her lack of motherly devotion, she is the closest person to Lestat. Now he's basically stuck with this meager life. He's trapped in ignorance given he can't read and therefore can't expand his knowledge. He's trapped by obligation to his family, so he can't venture past the borders of his small village. And he wants so much more out of life than to waste his time providing for a family he resents, trapped without purpose, and to die unknown. He wants his life to matter. He wants to branch out beyond the confines of his father's stagnant castle where no one wonders. There's no drive, no curiosity. There's nothingness. Now this is a huge motivator for Lestat. He wants his life to matter. He wants to learn as much as he can about the world around him, and he doesn't want to die without some bigger purpose. There are several key events that shape his interests, his actions, but I'm only going to focus on a few from his younger life that helped prompt him and get him kind of started. Now he occasionally would get tastes of grandeur, temporarily escaping the bleak outlook of his life. When he was a child, he'd been sent for a short while to study in a monastery. Not that he believed in God or superstitions. He actually makes several dozen points in this book, as do several other characters, about the good nature of getting rid of such things and such beliefs, and basically focusing on being more atheistic. Kind of funny considering who it's coming from, but I digress. But the clergy were friendly, and the place was far more warm and clean than his home. And for the first time in his life, he could read and write. Not much more than a few prayers in his name, but it was a promising start, and he felt that he could devote his life to a God he didn't believe in if only he could stay and read the stores of books bursting the church libraries. Alas, this was not to be. His pompous, proud father claimed that Lestat could learn all that he needed at home, that wasting his time with a nose in a book was pointless, and so he had him taken out of the school. This helped fuel Lestat's anger and bitterness towards his father for a lifetime, and kinda helped prompt his rebellion. Another time where he got his flair for dramatics and a taste of being a thespian is when he fled with a band of traveling commedia dell'arte performers. That's a type of Italian-styled theater where you have certain characteristics. Each character has like certain sets of ways that they're meant to act, and then you build up from those traits an impromptu comedy skit. I actually belonged to one of those kinds of troupes when I was in college. We were what was it? There was the 2-bit players, and yeah, it was the 2-bit players, and I was Il Dottore. I actually still have my mask. If I can find it, I will dig it out and show you at some point. But yeah, he ends up charming them with his good looks and drinks, and he convinces them to let him come with them. Now, he was around about 16, 17, and he spent the next few days acting in front of a crowd and making love to an actress in the group. In those moments, he felt such bliss and freedom, and wanted nothing more than to become an actor, to enjoy being a character, someone else, and to bring those that watched joy, and to break up their mundane lives with a glimmer of goodness. Once again, however, he was dragged away by his brothers and beaten severely by his father. But he had tasted a life beyond, and that stuck with him all the way up until he killed a pack of wolves with a few ancient weapons, a gun or two, a sword, and sheer willpower that pushed him past exhaustion. When he was in his early 20s, he'd been approached by the peasants of the village to deal with a wolf problem. And he did. If you've never seen a wolf, they are fucking massive. And for one man who lost his 2 bull mastiffs, big fucking dogs by the way, his horse and several weapons to bring down about 6 of them, that's fucking amazing. And this leads him to meeting his lover Nicholas. Unfortunately, for time's sake, I've got to move ahead in the story, but needless to say, Nicholas and Lestat run away from home together. They share a shabby apartment in Paris. Lestat keeps Nicholas warm with his wolf cape that Nicholas's father had made for him from the skins of the wolves he killed. And they get jobs in a small theater where Nicholas plays his violin and Lestat becomes a really handsome, popular, charming actor. And for about 6 months, everything is exuberant. Lestat is having the time of his life. He writes home to his mother through a scribe, because he still can't read or write, about the wonders of everything and how he's slowly becoming more and more successful. But unfortunately, this doesn't end happily for Lestat. There's a whole mess of stuff, but specifically, there's a being that just tears through their apartment one night and flies away, legit flies away with a terrified Lestat. The being is Magnus, a monster with a human face. He has sought Lestat out knowing that about the wolves and impressed with Lestat's beauty, courage, and will to live, and so against Lestat's will, makes him into a vampire. Shortly after doing so, Magnus flings himself into the fire, ending his eternal life and leaving Lestat utterly alone and depressed. From there, the story mainly follows Lestat as he adjusts to his powers, makes other people into vampires, meets a few random ones here and there. And it ties into the other story, Interview, quite well, given Lestat is the one who created the Theatre des Vampires. It was Lestat who riled the Coven Master Armand, who ended up being master of said theatre, that helped prompt the death of Claudia, so that he could get back at Lestat, and claim Louis, one of Lestat's beloved fledglings. It's all a tangled web of sinister soap opera-ness. But alas, it's very, very vast. It's a mass tangled web of, aha, Easter egg moments. Especially if you're like me and you've read the first book, and you've read all the other books. But, here are some key characters and their traits. Gabrielle. She is Lestat's mother, an elegant marquise who birthed 8 children and lost all but 3. She is a cold, calculating woman, not allowing herself to grow attached or to care. In her mortal lifetime with Lestat and their mortal family, she often kept quiet unless it concerned something about Lestat. She would sit idle and read, trying to escape the cage of her own life, one that was just as miserable, if not more so, than Lestat's. Bear in mind, she is the force that would rouse Lestat out of his bouts of anger and bitterness, prompt him to keep going, to try and force himself to carry on, and to try one day to escape. In fact, she's the one who helped encourage him to make friends with Nicholas, and she's the one who helped encourage them to leave to Paris. She would often use her favorite heirloom jewelry, things that were incredibly precious and rare, that were handed down by her family to her, to buy things for him, like his schooling, his beloved dogs, fine weapons to hunt with. She ends up highly adjusted to vampire life, relaxed and happy to be strong again, being saved from the very brink of death from her own son, by her own son, and having absolutely no moral issue with killing to survive, as she will gladly take down anyone, good or bad. She prefers to stay away from humanity and takes to exploring the forests and sleeping in the earth. She kind of feels that they are no longer of humanity, so why bother being among them now, when they could be anywhere and experience things no one else could possibly hope to. This puts a divide between her and Lestat, as Lestat comes to understand and love humanity far more than he ever did as a mortal himself, and eventually she leaves and Lestat ends up alone and hasn't seen Gabrielle in many years. He doesn't even know she's still alive. Nicholas is Lestat's lover. He befriends the man after he and his father come to gift Lestat the fur-lined cape as thanks for ridding the village of the wolves. Nicholas's father is the tailor of the town. He is a religious man, questioning deeply the nature of goodness, and often believes that sin is disguised as pleasure in order to manipulate people away from the light of God, such as with acting or the violin. Now, he really enjoys the violin, but he only enjoys it for himself, even though it brought shame upon his family, even though it got him to run away to Paris with Lestat, even though he worked. Alright, there's some technical difficulties. I'm just apologizing in advance for the awkward edit at this juncture, because what happened was I was recording, and a bunch of crap happened. Don't you go off. Okay. Bunch of crap happened, and I apologize for the janky edit. Just know that it was completely accidental. This piece of crap turned off in the middle of my filming, and I did not realize it because the lens was still out, so I thought it was still recording. So, back to my point. I think we were talking about Nicholas. So, Nicholas is this vampire. Basically, he becomes a vampire. He enjoys the violin solely for himself, and he brings shame upon his father. It got him to run away to Paris with Lestat, and he even worked in a theater. Basically, Nicholas goes mad with the idea that he, once he becomes a vampire, is a servant of Satan, and thus will make a mockery of all things good and virtuous. He will play his mad violin tunes while writing dark scripts, and, he'll talk about vampires of death. He will dangle sin in front of awing crowds with a grin. He's actually a very complex character. He actually is compared by Lestat himself to Louis in terms of their notions of goodness and things like that, and their overwhelming burden of sin, the way that they kind of conceptualize it. I mean, granted, Louis is stronger in that regard, and he does grow past that, whereas Nicholas never did. Eventually, Nicholas can't stand what he's become, and he can't cope very well with the whole notions of darkness and sin and things like that. He can't bring himself to deal with it, and so he ends up going into the fire himself, and he renders himself to nothingness. And this is after his hands get cut off by Armand. You may notice a puppy butt. Puppy decided to come and sit next to me. Now, Armand is a very complicated figure who is the leader of the Coven of Vampires in Paris. Now, eventually, these guys become the coven that lives in a theater house, but originally they lived as the Children of Darkness, living in graves and staying away from mortals. They are the devils of the night, and feast upon man's fears and blood in the name of Lucifer. He keeps them in line with fear of damnation, of life in general, locking some of them into the walls of the crypts that they sleep in, and make them starve, and yet being vampires, they can't die from that. He also sets them on fire when they lose their way, and only a small handful manage to escape from this and run to Lestat, who ultimately gives them the theater that he owns. Now, Armand initially wanted to kill Lestat and Gabrielle. They were sinners, they were blasphemers, they lived amongst humans and stepped inside the house of God. But so did Armand. Now, Armand is a traumatized victim of many, many, many things, and I won't go into it because it is a very long story. He's featured in interview through Queen of the Damned and so many scatterings throughout the series, and he has his own book, and it would take a very long time to go over his entire backstory, but let's just distill it very simply into he is a highly savage and highly damaged individual and acts in what he feels is the best interest of his coven and himself, which kind of borders lines on very selfish in a lot of respects. He desperately wants to find a lingering love, though. He does crave affection and love and closeness with another person. Okay, so Marius. Now, Marius is like this fatherly kind of figure to Lestat in some regard. He only meets him briefly, at least in the terms of the vampire Lestat, spending maybe 2-3 nights with the man. He originally learned of Marius through Armand. Armand tried initially, when his coven dissolved, thanks to Lestat, he tried to bond with Lestat, and he tried to bond with Gabrielle, and he was trying to get them to accept him, to let him be with them, and love them, and them love him in return, and stuff like that, right? But they didn't really trust him, and they had issues with that, and Armand was basically left at the theater, defeated, broken, upset, etc. But Marius, he is the maker of Armand and keeper of the mother and the father of the vampire race, Akasha and Enkiel. He lives in secrecy on an island when he comes to Lestat, and he's the one who explains where vampires came from, why they shouldn't tell humans what they are. He even explicitly says, do not underestimate human beings. They have a great advantage over us, and if they were made aware of us, they could destroy us. He gives wisdom about what kind of vampire mates to create. And in general, he becomes his friend that would help him at the drop of a hat, which Lestat could have done several times and stopped several bad things from happening to him and other people. Marius is at least a few thousand years old by this point, that meaning around, I think, the 1800s? I don't know, 17? No, it's still 1700s. Neither here or there. He's a few thousand years old by this point, and he's quite friendly, and he gives Lestat advice to stick close to humanity and live out at least one human lifetime with connections, a home, and a very carefully chosen family. Lestat himself is the star. He is this brash, bold, humorous, but kind of sad character. But nowhere do you feel this bottomless well of sorrow. You always see the light at the end of the tunnel, and know Lestat can and will, no matter what, eventually rise above and conquer, despite how he may feel at that moment. Does he always learn from what he does? Yes and no. He takes what he can from the experiences he gets and tweaks them for later situations, or disregards them when he feels like it. It's very situationally based. That actually comes into play later when he makes somebody. I won't get into too much of that, but if I say the name David, any Vampire Chronicle fan might know what I am talking about when I say that situational based morality. For example, Lestat prides himself in some regard for only killing the evildoer. He takes utter delight in hunting those cruel men and women that would slit your throat for a few coins. He loves making a mockery of their fighting back, loves draining them. But even with that being said, he's also killed innocent people. Made mention that when he was with Gabrielle, he became less concerned with the victims he took. One time, a young woman and her child in Notre Dame were just trying to help him, thinking that he was some sort of sick man crumpled in the corner, and he killed both of them. Lestat killed a fucking child. Now, most of the themes of the book are tied to what Louis dealt with in his, the nature of good and evil, to which basically Lestat answers that there are levels, basically. There is no moral absolutism, and he chooses to see that there's a lot of good. For example, when he and Gabrielle are kidnapped and dragged into the cemetery where all those cultish vampires are crying for them to be put to death on the pyre, he jokes with them about the nature of their life in servitude to a dark lord. He pushes their superstitions and tells them point blank that nothing will happen to them if they go inside a church, that humans are easy enough to fool if you can make yourself kind of look like them and you can make a living amongst them, and that no one should be living as they are doing. They have a right to exist and they have a right to do what they want. They are not inherently evil for being what they are. And even if they are evil, so what? Embrace it. Be it. Again, nothing will happen to you if you embrace it. You're already damned, so you might as well make the use of it. Lestat doesn't nearly struggle with killing as much as Louis does. He struggles with the idea that one day he's going to die, and then after he tries, but can't fully grasp the fact that he won't, he says that he'll never seek to end it, that he wants to continue on. He wants to be at the pulse of life at all times, and if that makes him evil, then he'll be Gentleman Death. This story invokes a very dark, surreal fear that many of us have. Time. We cannot suspend time. Our clocks are always ticking. We don't know when they will be up. So do your best to fill that time with pursuing happiness. Run away with your boyfriend to Paris and become an actor. Or when you're a vampire, learn what you can and can't do and relish the newfound freedom you have, the powers that you have. It's a funnier book than Interview, and it has rich embellishments and takes its time to try and capture sensations that many of us would have a hard time articulating. It keeps us engaged in the characters and their long, ongoing episodic adventure. There are moments where it can drag, where it can feel like the same information is shared with us or is bogged down with too much detail and description, but honestly, those parts are far and few. It is a complex tale with philosophy, a unique history of vampires, all from Anne Rice. World building that will help flesh out the entire series. There are moments where I found myself legit laughing out loud or biting my lip in distress. It moves you, it is powerful, and it will linger with you. There is so much to love here, and the fact that they are vampires is never forgotten. It's kept full force so that you can better empathize and understand the lives that they lead. Overall, guys, sink your teeth into a good book. I recommend this one.